As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm seated with Paul Shaver, Ian Galloway, and Bryce Hakama. Welcome to the table, gentlemen. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about famous men. So the Famous Men series are a series of books that our students read typically in grammar school and the grammar school ages. And I think there are a lot of interesting aspects of these books that are worthy of conversation. But before we get there, Paul, I know it's your habit to read the forest, and as hunting season comes near and the farm, but are you reading any actual books?
I listened to one recently,
yeah?
actually. Yes, I was, we talked about in the last time we sat down that I'd listened to Zorro, or the Curse of Capistrano, rather. But so then that got me on the idea of short novels I can listen to while I'm out on the farm reading the Book of Nature. I can read 2 books at once. So I, probably against my better judgment, but I'd heard so much of the book The Alchemist that I decided I was going to listen to it and see what all the hubbub was about. And now I think I'm getting a group of guys together to discuss it because it is thought-provoking. I would say it's...
Who's the author?
Paulo Coelho, I think is the way you pronounce it.
And is this a modern or older
Yes,
book?
it's modern. It's one of these things, I always say I've regretted every book I've picked up that was written within the last 50 years.
Sure.
But this one was actually, I probably still regret picking it up, but it is very thought-provoking. Okay. So as a thought-provoking book,
what genre? And how is it thought-provoking? Is it philosophically thought-provoking, existentially thought-provoking?
Its genre is medieval. It's set in the Middle Ages, and it's fiction, but it is intended to be a work of fiction that questions certain ways that you view the world. I think fundamentally it is Gnostic. Fundamentally, it has some serious fundamental flaws, but it couches them sometimes in religious terms, and so I don't recommend it, but it is, if you're looking for something to just kind of make your head go, huh, and then throw it in the trash, it's probably good.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
So I picked up Kafka's Metamorphosis. Have you guys read that?
Oh yeah.
Very short, and the premise is that a traveling salesman wakes up and he's a bug, and hilarity ensues.
I've not read that one.
It's interesting so far. It's very short, but I'm like, maybe
short is like 100 pages, or is it like a novel, or is it like a short story?
No, I'm reading it on audio, so it's 2 hours. So I have no idea.
Oh, okay, that's shorter than The Alchemist was 4 hours.
Okay.
So
yeah,
that's real nice and short.
Yeah, and I'm one car ride in.
Okay.
Ian,
I am still working through Don Quixote and chugging along, enjoying it. It's very funny.
What part are you at?
I'm still in the first part, so
Okay.
I'm in part 1, but I am in the first novel within Don Quixote, in the novel of the recklessly curious man. It's a story of Anselmo and his friend, and
what was this? I can't remember. It starts with an L.
Yeah, it's Lothario or something like that. Lothario.
Yes.
So just getting into that. Interesting.
and to be fair, you're up against a deadline on your thesis for your master's degree.
Yeah,
so you're probably reading hundreds of pages of books.
Yeah, I'm reading lots of books right now. But I discovered that I had a final draft due in just a couple days when I'm still in very much rough draft mode, but I've been able to work that out. I'll be able to submit what I have with the intention of actually completing it by December. So
you are reading a lot, but just maybe
reading a lot. That's more skimming, though.
Sure.
I'm looking for very specific bits of information, trying to find some examples from the text that I'm translating, trying to find where it may have come from. So it's been
And the
interesting.
text you're translating is from a book called the Peshitta, which is a Syriac translation
That's right. Yeah.
of the Old Testament that's really relevant for biblical studies.
Yeah, it
Just
is.
for
It
anyone
is.
listening to this who would be like,
Yeah.
oh, that's kind of a weird thing
Yeah.
to be doing in your off
It
time.
is. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Very fun. So I enjoy it.
Bryce, what have you been reading recently?
What have I been reading recently? I have not traditionally been a big reader in previous to starting to work here.
Wow.
But I have started working my way through The Name of the Wind, which I'm
Yes.
very good. Very
Yeah.
good.
I wish.
I'm through the first 5 chapters right now. And if you've never read it, he does framing devices for the first 5 chapters and then the plot finally starts. And so I'm finally getting into the meat of the actual story. My wife and I have finished the first 2 books in the Chronicles of Narnia for our collection of conversations that we've done so far, that you guys have done on this show so far. And finally, I'm reading a play right now, actually, Tuesdays with Maury. If you guys have ever read that.
Modern? Older?
Yeah, modern.
Okay.
It's very good.
Name of the playwright?
I'm not going to be able to remember right now.
Okay.
No, but it's good.
Genre?
Slice of life, a coming of age story, but a coming of age story that happens later in life. 30-year-old man goes wayward for the first 20 years or so of his life, comes back home, finds this old high school teacher who tried to impose some wisdom on him when he was younger, and then he comes back and engages in these conversations every Tuesday with Professor Maury. And so it's these recollections and insights on life and philosophy, and it's a very interesting show.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it.
Yeah. So transitioning from what we've been reading, which typically the reason that we, the 3 of us, sounds like Bryce more recently, have been our readers is because we love story. And story is really fundamental to the work we do. And that is very fundamental to Famous Men. And so, Paul, I want to start here when we talk about the Famous Men books. When you got the question, how should my school teach history in grammar school? Or using the Memoria Press curriculum, where's the history in this curriculum? How did you answer that question? How do you answer that question?
I think fundamentally the pathway of learning for a young child is from the concrete to the abstract. Right? And so when we look at history, the idea of the Berlin Wall falling in 1989 is a very abstract thing for a student.
It's abstract in that it's a different place.
It's a different place.
There's
They've never put their hands on the wall. They've never even they don't even really know how to conceptualize of Germany or the USSR. They probably don't even have a good grasp of World War II and what that meant, right? And so all of that, and 1989 is before they were born, and so right, sort of trying to put meat and bones on all of that for them is very difficult, right? And so, but when you tell somebody the story of some man or woman that lived, and by telling them that story, they start to feel the culture that it happened in. They start to feel the time period that it happened in. When you talk about swords and shields, you're like, oh, this isn't today, right? We don't use swords and shields today. And so they get a feel for it. It all becomes much more concrete because it's centered in a person, and they know people, right? And so they're imagining, it really fills their imagination with something that's more concrete than just a name and a date. And so since we're going from the concrete to the abstract, generally speaking, in the path of learning, then, and of course, at the end, we want them to know that Rome was founded in 753 BC, right? And that's a very abstract thing, right? It's just, it's a date and it was a foundation, right? But if they can concretely sort of imagine the whole story of Romulus and Remus, then that's something that they can grasp onto. And I mean, as an adult, we capture things better in story than just random bits of information. But particularly as children, that's important. So in the elementary years, we use famous men books.
Because they tell great stories.
Because they tell great stories. And that is what children are going to remember more so than, Columbus, sailed the ocean in 1492, right? You might have a little mnemonic rhyming device that helps them remember it, but it doesn't mean nearly as much to them until they dig into, okay, then what happened after Columbus and why, who commissioned Columbus to come, and what was the story of Columbus trying to gather up enough money to have ships to go do this vision he had, right? All that stuff, and all of a sudden, oh, okay, this all makes more sense to me.
Ian, you spend a good amount of your days talking to homeschool parents and advising them about curriculum. Do you ever get this question, how is history taught in the Memoria Press curriculum? And do you find yourself weaving famous men into that conversation?
Yeah, I think so, because I think a lot of people, that's just to be frank, that's something that they have to have. I mean, they're trying to work out, okay, what do I have to teach my children? What do I have to report to the state? All kinds of stuff. And so they want to know what kind of history that we're teaching. They also may wonder, why aren't we doing more American history or something like that? But I think when we're able to discuss, at this stage, these kids, exactly what Paul said, they need stories. They need models of virtue and vice. They need to know the right kinds of actions or the wrong kinds of actions, what not to do. I think that's how we often approach this conversation with famous men of Rome or famous men of Greece. These are figures that existed, and sometimes maybe these stories don't have all the elements. Maybe the things are not necessarily covered at this age. That's fine. There are things that students will get to, and as they get older and as they begin to think more abstractly, maybe then at that point they need to start thinking about the reasons why things happened. Make those historical connections. What are the things going on here that have influence and outcomes over here, but they're not there yet when they're reading these kinds of books. They need to know, okay, Cincinnatus was a good man, and this is what he did.
So Bryce, one of the reasons you're sitting at the table is that our marketing team, you're on the marketing team here at Memoria Press, for those who don't know. And one of the projects the marketing team has done, and hopefully somebody who's listening has seen these videos, are a series of videos we did about the characters in Famous Men. And I know you did a lot of work on those videos. Yeah. And you've told me before you weren't classically educated growing up like many of us who work at Memoria Press.
No.
Were there particular things about these stories that you were kind of learning for the first time that captivated you as the team was trying to put these videos together?
Yeah, I think Greece is probably the best example because we worked through Famous Men of Greece first. And so I'll live in that for a bit. Just knowledge based, in spite of the fact that these may not be necessarily factually dense as a lot of other texts might be, there's a ton in there that was just not encompassed in my education whatsoever. And so I found characters that I could really love when I was reading. Demosthenes, he's hanging up in the wall back over there. He's one of my favorite characters now as a result of doing this show, and in doing the show, needing to read these books specifically. It makes me envious that this could have been a part of my education and it wasn't. So the characters themselves are one example. Then the other example is, I think a good example that I could probably provide here is that the Battle of Salamis is this huge, enormous event that takes place. Everybody's there. So many of the characters, if you're currently teaching this book right now, the Battle of Salamis, go look it up. Everybody's there. And it was such a cool revelation as we're doing more of the episodes of the show, oh wait, he's there and he's there. Oh, everyone is here. So anybody who becomes anybody in the history of ancient Greece is at this place in this location. It just becomes this interesting fixating point in history to lock onto, and you wouldn't know that. Right. There's so much that you wouldn't know in regards of if you never read it, if you never had the opportunity to engage with it in the first place.
Can I just say, in preparation for this episode, we don't normally get to prepare, but I did get a sneak peek what we were talking about. So I just went through and read the table. I cheated. I cheated.
You have the invite to the pre-production meeting and you just don't come. All right. So don't blame that on me.
So I was looking at the table of contents, and as I was looking through them, when I was a child, I remember we used Famous Men of Rome, Famous Men of Greece. So like those ones aren't. I don't know if we had Famous Men of Middle Ages when I was a kid, but going through the table of contents, I was like, there are so many names in here that in any standard history course, the student would never be exposed to.
That's right.
Yep.
And yet you get to learn all about their lives, and in so doing, learn that period of history. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I was actually blown away by that just today, looking at the list of names.
And I love the point that Bryce made about, even someone like Demosthenes. There's something about relating to these characters that when you encounter them in the more maybe factually dense history that students do in high school or college in their world civ class, that they're like, I love that character. And it actually is planting the seeds for loving learning later on.
The golden part of the books as I read them, because the series in and of itself is narrative. Like that was the goal. The objective was to tell those stories. And when you get to the books themselves, they are just narratively golden, narratively rich. And for a lot of other educational systems out there and other history systems, it would be, oh, that's a name on a wall with a date. And that's all you'd get. And you'd get, this person did this. And what you were describing at the beginning, it is the factual events of this person's life. What this does, and what these books do specifically, is that it unlocks the doors to the stories of these characters' lives and the significance that the narrative events that play out. And it's easier to follow. It's easier to engage with. It's just fun to read.
Right. All right. So speaking of the dates and the names, Paul, one thing someone could say approaching this curriculum is, A, how is my student going to navigate the timeline of history by using these books? And B, if you look at our course scope and sequence, we suggest that you do Rome before Greece. It's actually not in order.
Sure.
So are we doing a disservice to our students by teaching them history in a way that's out of order? And will our students ever be able to grasp a timeline? And then let me throw on a C, if you can keep this all in your mind. The first several chapters of Famous Men of Greece are based on mythology. It's not even history. And we also, the beginning of classical studies, style Irish Greek myths. Defend yourself, Paul.
A, no.
Remind me what A was again?
A was, are we doing a disservice to our students by teaching them non-chronologically?
Yeah.
So if we start with that one, I don't remember. I was glad you stopped me because I don't remember B. So no, we're not doing a disservice because again, we're trying to go to the most comprehensible to the most abstract.
Right.
And Rome is much more comprehensible because it functioned first as a monarchy, then a republic, then an empire. Greece has so many convoluted city-state wars between themselves. Then Persia comes in, they all unite. Then you've got this Delian League, and what is that? It's really kind of convoluted about what's going on there. Besides the fact that there were so many sort of pockets of of different what was Greece, but they had their own little name, and so then you got a bunch of issues with names too,
right, going
on in Famous Men of Greece. So that's just easier to grasp when you're a little older, and so when you're younger. Famous Men of Rome, it's very in a sense, it's systematic in the sense that you can follow along. We're always talking about Rome, and we're talking about one city and sort of the story of how that went. So, no, I think we're doing a service by doing it out of order. B was timeline.
Yes.
So. A little shameless plug here. That's why we have the timeline program. Right. We do want the students to walk out with names and dates, but those are going to be meanmeaningful names and dates to them.
That's right.
So we have resources to help them do that. I think even in the study guides, there's more detailed timelines in there just for that book. So they are helped to contextualize what they're learning.
Right.
And C, mythology. I actually wanted to bring this up when Ian was talking. You said something that made me think of it, is that some of these stories are not real stories that need to be told for the culture that is being passed on.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
So, I mean, even I've never dug into actually the historicity of like the early monarchy period of Rome. But occasionally, like I sit there going, the Tarquins? Do we really know the Tarquins existed?
Yeah, right.
Numa Pompilius. Well, but, I mean, whether we know it or not, like that's the story that was handed down, and it says something about the Roman people. That story says something about them, and so that helps us then know better this culture that's being passed on. Then the real men, the men that actually existed, why they do what they do is because they're motivated by these stories that they've been told from early on.
A great example of this is Lycurgus. And when I was working in the editing room, there was a question at some point about something relating to his time frame, and I went really deep on Lycurgus.
Is it Lycurgus or is it Lycurgus?
Well, I don't know. I don't speak. I'm not an ancient Greek speaker.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
Come on, Shane. Come on, man.
All right. But anyway, you went real deep. So
I went deep on it. Well, his historicity is dubious, but he certainly is an interesting character that inspired a lot of people in like Plutarch and Plato and others. And so there is something like really foundational to his connection specifically to the Olympics that is important to know and to know his story. But can you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt whether he was actually a human or not? No one really knows. He may have been a composite. The same is true of Solon and Draco, kind of more famously, because of their political philosophy. But I think Lycurgus just has a special place in my heart because I read a lot about who people think he was.
Right. And I mean, when I talk about early Roman monarchy period, like I would like to throw Cincinnatus in there, but I refuse to admit that Cincinnatus didn't exist because Cincinnatus is my guy. I mean, he's
a farmer.
He's a farmer.
That's right.
Yeah. And he's just
I didn't know that people
farm.
question Cincinnatus' history.
I don't know. I always, for whatever reason, I question it because it's so early in the Republic. But I don't. But for all we know, he really could be a dude.
At the end of the day, historians question everyone's historicity. They would question my historicity, if it came down to it.
That's the consistent through line as far as doing the additional research to the book and trying to add in some additional historicity, however you say it, to these characters was the massive debate that's ongoing about who was real, who was not real, who was this absolute garbage person, who was the greatest person who ever walked the earth. It's inconsistent anyways. And so we're entering into what are the stories that need to carry forward? What are the stories that matter to kids? What will teach them and transmit virtue to them? That's really what it boils down to.
Yeah. So Ian, kind of picking up on what Bryce is saying there is some question about these characters weren't perfect. They weren't. That's right. We're getting a snippet of a lot of these characters' lives. Do we need to be concerned about that as teachers and about the fallenness or the flawedness of the characters from the Famous Men series?
No, I mean, that's a great question. But I think as those who are committed to particularly a classical and a Christian education, I mean, the way that we approach any story like this is to recognize the humanity of people, that there is a fallenness to humanity that is uncovered. Like we can't get over that, until Christ comes. And so that there's a grace that we have to extend to these figures. But at the same time, I do think what we were talking about earlier, that you go from the concrete to the abstract, we do a disservice if we bring in the abstract too soon, because students need at this point, they need to be told stories about people who did good things and to see that as heroic and right and good. And later on, we can begin to instruct them, and we do that in things like the Book of the Ancient Greeks. So you do Famous Men of Greece, and then a couple of years later, you do the Book of the Ancient Greeks, where things are a little bit more complicated. They're more complex. And what you're doing is you're allowing the student to develop. They learn the virtue and the vice. I mean, the other thing is, you learn about Nero, and we're not learning about virtue. We're learning about vice. We're learning about things that are not to be done. But at the same time, as you get older, you begin to learn about his complexity, and you begin to maybe at times understand things about him. And so you have to go from the concrete to the abstract. And part of that is at the beginning, telling what's good and what's bad in very clear terms. And then as they get older, beginning to recognize that, like any human being, there's a complexity here that involves both, that has both. They're fallen.
I'd like to give Ian a hearty round of applause on that one, because somebody could raise the objection that these stories are sanitized of that sort of
reality.
complexity. Yeah, the reality, right? But it's important for these students to have those clear models of virtue and the clear instances of what happens when you're not virtuous.
And we're participating in it. It's not like we just came up with this idea. This is a tradition that goes back a long way of telling stories about virtuous things that were done and reading about their lives. All of these books were based loosely on Plutarch and Livy, and that we're in that tradition that values virtue formation, and stories always been a part of that.
That's right.
Yeah, and you think about when you don't have like a plethora of books everywhere, and before you're learning from books, what are you doing? You're just telling stories about people. Let me tell you the story of Joan of Arc, or let me tell you the story of Muhammad or Saint Benedict or whoever, right? I'm just going to tell you the story of this person, because you're not just going to sit down and tell this kid let me tell you the history of the 1400s in Ireland, right? Right. So we're just doing the same thing, just in book form.
Yeah. Now, one question that strikes me is, we have pointed out these characters are flawed, but we also are answering the question oftentimes, how do we teach history at Memoria Press? Are these good historical texts, even though these characters are flawed? Maybe some of them aren't historical. There's mythology involved. Paul, how would you defend the value of these books as a good starting place for history?
I think when you're teaching history, you're teaching a culture. And part of teaching that culture is teaching that culture's stories. So, it wasn't like we sat down like detectives in togas. We didn't sit down and write a fully fictional piece set in Roman times and said, well, we should stick that in Famous Men of Rome. No, these are stories that the Romans passed down to themselves and by extension then down to us. And that's what's in the book. So if we want to learn what Rome was, we even need those stories, even if they may not be 100% historically accurate.
I mean, I think I'm just going to draw from something like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like these stories, Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Aeneas, all these stories were so foundational to the people themselves and who they were. It defined their ethos. If we don't know them, even though we have no idea about the history of, Troy and other things, and maybe we have some idea, but we don't know anything about what happened there other than what Homer tells us, those stories are inseparable from the real people that happen. They go along with the bricks and the stones that built those countries and nations and peoples.
And let's be clear, the narrative itself makes clear this is mythology,
Right.
or this is a historical figure we're trying to talk about. So it's not like if you picked up this book and started reading it, you'd be confused about, wait, is this mythology? Is this real?
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
It does make it clear in there.
And Paul, do you think that speaks to the broader goals of history? Have you seen a difference between what we're trying to do in history education at Memoria Press or Highlands Latin School compared to what other competing alternatives might be trying to do in history?
I think setting students up this way, I think somebody mentioned earlier about love of learning and it just kind of sets them up for that. But I really do think it makes them think about history differently. And so even when they hit the textbooks later on, where they're, going through it chronologically and looking at, the economics of the culture and this, that, and the other, they can still contextualize it as being about people's stories, that it means more to them. And when you asked that question, I was thinking of my wife, and she can point to the teachers, like the way he taught history made it so history has never interested me ever again. Right. And sometimes students just need to learn things. You just need to do the hard thing and just focus on it, learn it. But if we can make it come alive, let's make it come alive. And I think that's what this does.
I had first of all a great history teacher for APS history in high school that inspired me with like a love of learning, and not just a love of learning, but also taught us how to write. I mean, she did so much beyond just history, because history is a subject where you get so many different things. I mean, you can get You get stories, so you get some elements of literature. We talked about before in our guides, we're drawing out vocabulary and all these kinds of things. With history, you've got so many different things that you can get better at. You can build in a lot of skills. But I wanted to piggyback off of, your wife having a bad experience. I had a great experience at, I think it was Liberty Hall in Philadelphia. And I had this was years ago. I was probably 9 or 10 years old, but our guide came in. He was funny. It was just, he told us stories that were funny. He was funny himself, but the way he approached the history of that place, I mean, he almost made it sacred. It almost felt like what happened here is what America is, and that kind of inspiration, I think, can only come from stories that pass along those things. You don't get that from just the names and dates. You've got to know why a land is worth protecting before you get to the war that protected it.
Ken Dennis made a great point early on in this show, in talking about teaching history to students. He said you got to put the story over onto them. And I didn't understand exactly what that meant, but hearing him talk, and then from that moving into putting the story over onto the internet and trying to communicate these stories in a way that people would be interested in them. And it's incredibly difficult. It's a very amazing skill to have. And years of experience of telling stories can get us to that point, but these set you up really, really well.
Right.
Well, and Mr. Dennis was a master of it, but he would, he was teaching high school level. And so you'd walk in, we're using these textbooks that are thick. At that point, we're trying to go through chronologically and talk about everything. And you walk into any class, and what is he doing up there? He's telling stories. And that was what was making it come alive. And it was a beautiful thing.
So I want to ask you guys another question about the books, but I feel like I need to give you a second to collect your thoughts.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that is, what is your favorite character or a favorite character from the Famous Men books? Paul, you mentioned Cincinnatus. Would you say he's the favorite, or?
I think you explicitly called him your guy.
He is my guy.
Yeah.
Actually, in trying to think back and think of the people that I learned from in that book as a student, he's the one that I remember. I mean, it just stuck out so much to me of leadership that you're willing to give up that leadership when your task is done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that's exactly it. I mean, I mentioned Cincinnatus earlier because that's kind of the guy for me too. Not because I'm a farmer, I'm not a farmer, but because that willingness to give up leadership is a powerful thing. I mean, and you hear that kind of story, you're prepared for George Washington not going up for another term, for laying aside leadership when the time comes. And you have a precedent for that. So it pays dividends to have a story like that down the road when you get to later on in history.
Bryce, I don't remember if we did this character, Junius Brutus.
We did not do Junius Brutus.
Okay, so Junius Brutus is probably my favorite from Famous Men of Rome. He is one of the two consuls from the very early Republic that when Tarquin Superbus was showing his arrogance. I believe it's his son who defiles a woman and he lets it go. He is the one who helps lead this rebellion in the Republic, and then his own son is a part of the next generation that's bemoaning the lack of central leadership that the Republic has, and he holds justice and ends up condemning his own son as a traitor. And I've always found that story very compelling.
Yeah. Man, I had 3 people and I still, wow. I'm in a toss up right now between Demosthenes and Aristides for Famous Men of Greece. Horatius for sure in Famous Men of Rome.
Yep.
I mean, how's that story not inspiring?
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Why do 300 when you've got 3 versus
That's right.
1,000? Like what are we doing? I think so. There's Horatius in Rome, but I think in terms of Greece, I think I'd have to land on Demosthenes still. Like to overcome the level of complications surrounding his inability to speak well, his financial destitution, leaving him in a spot that basically said, there is no shot for you here. And to find the persistence and the perseverance to do outlandish methodology of learning how to speak and learning how to speak well, I think that resounds a bit in me. And
Sure.
in
As a storyteller,
actor, filmmaker, like the whole, all of that kind of lives inside of him. And so by proxy, I see myself in Demosthenes' story quite a bit. And so there's just a lot of really good ones in there.
Yeah.
I'd like to put out there that I've never liked Julius Caesar.
Okay. Tell me why that is.
Why didn't you like Julius Caesar?
I think because I see the movement from Republic to Empire as a fundamentally flawed action that he was catalyst for. And now, I mean, probably if I looked at it objectively, there's no way for Rome to stand without somebody doing what he did because of the division that was happening in the Republic. But I've always been like, dude, just please let the Senate be. And I've always, in some ways, I've cheered for Brutus
and Cassius, apparently.
Yeah.
That's one of the beauties of that play, Julius Caesar, is that throughout history, it really has been read both ways.
Yeah.
And I think that he is a fascinating test case, and just your like kind of political thinking can be revealed by that character.
I'll contribute to your point. I mean, the Pax Romana came as a result of Caesar Augustus refusing to be called emperor. He called himself consul. And that is significant to say he steps away from that empirical title. And in that, out of him flows this years and years of peace for Rome.
He does, but everybody knew he had the power.
He did.
So,
Yeah.
How much of that is...
I think even in you taking a stance is the first start of making better things
but
happen.
then as soon then it just starts the pattern of as soon as the guy in charge dies, then let's fight a war, figure out who's on top, and then let's do it again.
Yeah.
Oh, just makes me sick.
So in an actual educational environment, whether it be homeschooling or in a school, what should the goal be for our teachers who are reading these books to students or teaching these books? Should the students know every detail about the characters? Are you trying to inspire them? Are they trying to apply specific virtue to the students' lives? What do you think should be some of the tangible goals?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can necessarily speak to all the pedagogical goals like as you can or Paul can. As an editor here, I'm always really paying attention to story. I mean, that's kind of my thing here. And when I look at something like this, yeah, I mean, of course, know the names, know the dates. Like that's part of growing up. That's part of learning a material and mastering it. But I think the highest goal of this is that virtue formation, which is, I think, the highest goal of classical education. Is it's not just giving you information; it's turning you into a kind of person, a good kind of person, a virtuous kind of person. And so, I think a goal, and I'll let you guys speak to that further. The highest goal, I should say, is that imparting of virtue, and which is why I think at this point, even if you have flawed individuals, you draw out what's virtuous and you hold on to that and you make that the thing. And as they get older, they still can recognize that there was something about this story that inspired me, that made me a better person, a more virtuous person. I can hold on to that while still rejecting these other things.
Sure. Paul, can you speak to the pedagogical aspects?
Well, I think for one, we make a full language study out of it too. I mean, so you're pulling out vocabulary, you're doing comprehension questions, so they're learning how to read deeply as they do it. But they are walking out like with what Ian talked about with dates and names and things like that. So, I think your end goals are alongside that sort of virtue formation and that inspiration, alongside all of that, you're seeking for the contextual knowledge that is going to be built on in literature and in history later on. That makes them a part of the great conversation. If you don't know who these famous men of Rome are, you're going to be missing large sections of that great conversation. And so as well as some geography. Like you have to know when we're talking about this war that's happening over here, what part of land are we fighting over? So all of those things do get pulled in. But the major thing is you're going to know the people, the major facets of their story and when it happened.
Yeah, I think to be very clear, there's no dichotomy between the virtue formation and the knowledge that comes alongside of it. So,
yeah, that's great. Well, guys, I really enjoyed this conversation. Enjoy talking about these stories. Love these stories. I know you guys too. So I'd encourage anyone who has not read them. It's not just for kids. You should pick them up. You should read them, and you'll enjoy them.
And there's we haven't mentioned it at all in this podcast, but there's a Famous Men in Modern Times as well.
That's right.
It's not in any of the curricular packages. So but it's good to pick up and read.
Sure is. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.